Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore. Colombians who favor the peace agreement between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, are still reeling from Sunday's surprising referendum result in which a slight majority of 50.2% voted against the agreement. Here is what one of the peace agreement supporters had to say about the result.
Lo que demuestra este resultado es que el 50% de la gente que salió a votar se dejó convencer de un mensaje de odio, de un mensaje de venganza, de un mensaje de atarnos al pasado.
It took 4 years to negotiate this peace agreement, which was supposed to put to an end one of the world's longest civil wars, one that lasted 52 years. Opponents argued that the agreement gives too much broad and amnesty to FARC leaders for crimes that were committed during the conflict. However, rural populations that bore the brunt of the conflict overwhelmingly supported the agreement. Joining us to discuss the Colombian peace referendum result is Mario Murillo. Mario is a Colombian activist. He's also a professor of communications at Hofstra University, and he has covered Colombia for over 25 years. He's also the author of the book titled Colombia and the United States: War, Unrest, and Destabilization. Thanks for being on The Real News, Mario.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Why is it that you think the referendum lost? Many reports point to the low turnout, but compared to the first round presidential vote in 2014, in which only 40% of Colombians voted, the turnout at 37% for the referendum was not much lower.
Well, it's ironic that the winners in this plebiscite that took place on Sunday, the people who supported the no vote, or in other words, were opposed to the peace agreement signed between the FARC and the government of Santos. They point to this as democracy at work in Colombia, that the people have spoken. And perhaps this is democracy. This is quintessential Colombian-style democracy, where under 40% of the people vote, where the turnout was so low, but also the discrepancy, the difference was so close, but that the regional discrepancies were very, very apparent, as you pointed out in the introduction, that you had the regions of the country that were most and continue to be most affected, the people who live the most daily reality of this 52-year war, those who've been facing forced displacement, who've been facing attacks against civilian populations, those who've faced massacres over these many years, they're the ones who are calling for an end. They're the ones who supported the peace agreement by overwhelming numbers, whereas in the areas, the urban areas, with exception to Bogota, ironically, the capital, and some other urban centers, for the most part, distanced and apart from the war, watching the war from a distance, they overwhelmingly supported the no vote. So this goes to show the wide discrepancies in the population and the perhaps unfairness of the entire process. And my feeling is that there was too much weight put on this referendum, on this plebiscite, without really considering the potential consequences of the no vote down the road. And I think finally the other question is the level of intimidation, fear, misinformation that was being put forward by the no vote, and how they had a consistent, permanent platform in the mainstream media in Colombia was unbelievable. And the fear and the misinformation, I think, ultimately ended up getting the upper hand in the final tally.
That's an interesting point, Mario, because my next question is, what was the role of the media in the cities?
Well, I mean, you know, this is part of the collective narrative that has been building for decades in Colombia. I mean, if you look at the war in Colombia, I've been following it for a better part of a quarter century. The mainstream news media, with some exceptions, I mean, I don't want to clump them all in the same basket, because there are very good examples of investigative journalism in Colombia done under very difficult conditions. But for the most part, the mainstream television networks, the big corporate channels, the radio, they echo essentially the ongoing narrative that the Colombian crisis, the war in Colombia, the difficulties in Colombia are the result of the intransigence and the militarism and the terrorism of the FARC rebels who have been waging a war in the countryside for 52 years. And all the other transgressions being carried out by military, by the paramilitary groups that were working alongside the military for many years. All of those are kind of swept under the rug as if not as significant. So that narrative continued, and obviously when you have somebody as politically and as media savvy as the former president, Álvaro Uribe, who had the 2 terms as president and who is currently a senator, and he's basically the poster boy of the anti-FARC extremism in Colombia that used that platform on a daily basis to scare the public and to say that this accord was going to bring Colombia to surrender Colombia to communism, that Colombia is going to become another Venezuela or Cuba with scarcities, that the guerrillas are going to be taking over the country, that we're surrendering to FARC terrorism, and obviously the pro peace accord perspective was presented, but when you have that kind of narrative filtering news all the time, it's very hard to contest. And I think that definitely had a big role to play in the ultimate result.
So what can we expect will happen next? Because both President Santos and FARC leader Timoshenko have said that they will go back to the negotiating table, but previously they both also said that neither side would be able to win more concessions from the other side.
Yeah, that's going to be the tricky part, and because now Uribe and the right has the kind of political upper hand as a result of Sunday's plebiscite results, there's some question as to whether or not now Uribe is going to be a part of this renegotiation, and his people. And the bottom line is that Uribe has never intended to really negotiate with the FARC. His fixation and the fixation of the right wing in Colombia is that they can militarily liquidate the FARC from the political space in Colombia if they're only given a little bit more time to do so. And any political concessions, whether it's spaces in the Congress, which is part of the agreement that for the next 10 years the FARC would get 10 seats, uncontested seats, so they can insert themselves into the legal political system of Colombia, and then in 2026, in that election cycle, then they would be expected to compete directly with those spaces. Now, this is a small part of the Congress. We're talking about 10 seats out of 256 seats or something like that, and yet the opposition was saying that that's unacceptable to let these criminals into our Congress. This conveniently overlooks the fact that for the last 10, 15 years, we've had a major infiltration of the right, including politicians with direct links with right-wing paramilitary groups that were responsible for thousands of deaths in the countryside for the last 20 years. And they were allowed and given spaces in kind of a different process without any people yelling about impunity and providing spaces for terrorists and narco-terrorists. So it's a major contradiction, and it's a real concern that if Uribe is given that space to renegotiate, hopefully the peace ceasefire that they have agreed to, both sides have agreed to, and they've been more or less respecting for the last almost 2 years. Hopefully that will hold, but we have to keep in mind something that hasn't really been reported much is that in the countryside you have a lot of armed groups, including the remnants of the paramilitary groups that supposedly demobilized back in 2006, paramilitary groups that have deep-rooted hatred towards the guerrillas who have already announced publicly that the minute these FARC combatants surrender their weapons and become part of the kind of political space in the post-quote-unquote accord, post-conflict period, that these would be military targets, that there would be official military targets of these right-wing groups, these so-called criminal bands that continue to operate in the countryside, and that essentially would kind of lead to yet another round of bloodshed in Colombia. And that's a big concern, and hopefully that the international community, hopefully the cooler heads will prevail both by the FARC and the government forces, and that this would remain in check. But that's a real serious consideration that, again, is not being discussed much in the wake of this plebiscite fiasco.
You know, one of the key issues for the no-vote campaigners, such as the former right-wing president Alvaro Uribe, as you've mentioned, was the amnesty. Is there any chance that this will be renegotiated?
There's, the question about the amnesty is another one of those things that has been misrepresented, because I think what they're trying to do is talk about transitional justice. If you look at the accord, they're talking about transitional justice, and it's still to be determined, according to the provisions of the accord, that depending on what level of participation the specific combatant or leader, what role they played during the war. It would depend on a number of different factors as to what would their political and legal situation be. What there was concern of was that they weren't going to all spend the rest of their life in prison, that there was going to be some kind of transitional period in which they would be able to pay back. They would have to accept their crimes. They would have to compensate victims of the actions that were carried out. Some crimes would be amnestied. The crime of rebellion, which is seditious, like what we would have here in terms of sedition, that would be amnestied because it would be considered a political crime. But the issue of drug trafficking and the role that they might have played in drug trafficking is still up in the air. That would have to be determined through congressional legislation that would be debated in the Congress in terms of how that would be hammered out. And then the issue of the leaders, the idea is, well, okay, if they're involved in certain crimes against humanity, there would be some kind of legal repercussions behind that. But is the solution, if we're talking about national reconciliation, a process of peace and reconciliation and truth, does it necessarily mean that they have to serve time in prison? If we look at the paramilitary groups in which Álvaro Uribe had a negotiation and a peace agreement with back in 2006 and 2007, the vast majority of them did not and are not serving time for crimes carried out, massive crimes carried out in Colombia during their war against the FARC, but really against the civilian population in strongholds of the FARC. There's a number of them who are now serving time in U.S. federal prisons as a result of their crimes in terms of narco-trafficking, but that has nothing to do with the crimes against humanity that they carried out. They're not serving time for their war crimes that they carried out in Colombia, so that's a totally different issue.
So when the agreement was initially signed, the Obama administration tried to take some credit for the agreement, saying that Plan Colombia helped to bring about peace. But what has been the role of the U.S. in this conflict and in the peace agreement and in the referendum result?
I guess they can take credit. The United States can take credit in militarizing to an extreme the situation in Colombia. And it's, I write about this in my book in 2004, where I look at the U.S. military role in Colombia. And essentially, it's been more or less consistent since the 1950s, which is primarily focused on a military strategic alliance with the Colombian armed forces and state security forces, its intelligence services, et cetera. And it was always looked at as maintaining security and stability from the Cold War to the drug war to the war on terror. It's evolved in terms of its packaging, but essentially it's been the same. It's been a military security strategy from the start. And the last 15 years where the Plan Colombia came into effect, under President Clinton, by the way, this started back in 1999, certainly had a devastating impact. It led to the demise, in many ways, of the FARC in terms of security and intelligence exchange of information, the technology exchange that was going on between the Colombian armed forces, the training. And so they did have a major impact on the strategic military situation on the ground. The FARC went from an 18,000 strong to 20,000 strong army in the beginning of the century to what they are now, anywhere between 7,000 and 8,000 combatants, probably less than that. And so that's clearly a military victory. But think about what that has meant in the last 15 years as it's been implemented in terms of massive displacement, up to 5 million people internally displaced, tens of thousands of people killed, disappeared, tortured, forced to flee because of the political violence, not to mention the impact that it has had on the kind of the wealth of the country, if we want to go that far. And so to claim victory and to say that this was the result of U.S. policy is the utmost in cynicism. This is what Hillary Clinton has been trying to say in her public pronouncements about U.S. foreign policy successes. And it's really cynical to say that this has been a success, given that there could have been a different approach years ago that might have led to a political solution earlier on than what we're seeing right now.
So Mario, given the result that we saw happen over the weekend in Colombia, given that it took 4 years to even bring this referendum to the people, what do you expect is going to happen in Colombia in the coming weeks and certainly months and years?
Well, I really do hope that the cooler heads will prevail. The FARC and the government are meeting, and they're expected to continue to meet in Havana. President Santos did bring together or at least invited all the other political sectors, political parties, including Uribe's party, for some consultations as to see what's next, perhaps to concede certain things, which is still not clear. Uribe's party is hesitant to sit down just yet. They want to so-called analyze the results of Sunday's referendum, so they're not necessarily accepting that invitation. I personally think that the whole thing about the referendum was a mistake. To put this to a vote. We saw other examples of this in recent years. With the Brexit vote in the UK, where you put this kind of historical moment where, after decades of trying to resolve this conflict between the FARC and the government, and you put it to the polls when so much is at stake and so many ways of manipulation could take place, I think it was just a big mistake. And hopefully, the social movements and the sector that is pro-peace, that is pushing for the end of the conflict, will still have its say as the situation moves forward. But I still think that the repression. The right has never conceded anything to the left in Colombia without a major brutal fight and the loss of life. And I'm concerned that now that this referendum supposedly shows the will of the people, when it's really not. We're talking 50,000 vote differential in a country of 45 million people. It's not a big difference in terms of support and opposition to this accord. I'm afraid that this is just going to give credence to the right to carry out an even more visible, perhaps even violent backlash against those sectors who've been promoting an end to a cessation to the hostilities between FARC and the government.
We've been speaking with Mario Murillo. Mario is a Colombian activist. He's also a professor of communications at Hofstra University. He's been covering Colombia for over 25 years, and he is the author of the book titled Colombia and the United States: War, Unrest, and Destabilization. Mario, we really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.